In just 24 hours, on the 28th of June, 2026, the fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran didn't just crack it, completely shattered. What began as a supposed period of de-escalation has now exploded into one of the most dangerous and rapid escalations since the conflict began. A massive American airstrike, a burning oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, carrying over 2 million barrels of crude ballistic missiles raining down on U.S. bases in Bahrain and Kuwait, and Iran openly declaring for the first time that it has no choice but to pursue nuclear weapons. All of this unfolded in a single day. This is not just another exchange of fire. This is proof that the ceasefire signed on June 17th has failed its most basic purpose. Instead of bringing peace, it has become a dangerous window that allowed Iran to quietly rebuild its military capabilities that the U.S. had previously destroyed. Now, American forces are being forced to strike the same targets all over again. At the center of this storm is a brutal truth. Every time America hits Iran, destroys its air defenses, missile stockpiles, and drone bases, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps uses the ceasefire period to rebuild faster, deeper, and often with help from China and Russia. On June 28th, that cycle turned vicious. From the early morning attack on a Panamanian-flagged oil tanker to retaliatory strikes and Trump's stark warning that Iran will not exist if necessary, the region is once again on the brink. I have been following this conflict closely, and I must say, we are now entering the most serious phase since February. The ceasefire didn't prevent war, it incubated the next one. This is the reality no one wants to admit. And in the next few minutes, we're going to break down exactly how we got here in just 24 hours. To fully understand the explosive events of the 28th of June 2026, we must first place them in the proper historical and chronological context. The current round of direct conflict between the United States and Iran began on the 28th of February, 2026. After months of rising tensions, Washington launched a major military campaign targeting Iranian nuclear facilities, missile bases, and Revolutionary Guard infrastructure. The intense bombing phase lasted until the 7th of April 2026, when a fragile ceasefire was established. On that day, both sides agreed to pause major combat operations while diplomatic efforts continued in Doha. For roughly 10 weeks, from April 7 to mid-June, the region experienced a tense but relatively quiet period. On the 17th of June 2026, the two sides signed a Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, in Doha, Qatar. Many analysts hoped this agreement would serve as a foundation for long-term de-escalation. However, almost immediately after the ink dried, troubling signs emerged. Fast forward to the 27th of June 2026, just one day before the major escalation, U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, confirmed that American forces conducted fresh airstrikes inside Iran. These strikes targeted surveillance systems, communication centers, air defense positions, UAV storage facilities, and Iran's naval mine-laying capabilities. According to CENTCOM, the operation was ordered directly by the president in response to repeated Iranian violations of the ceasefire. Then came June 28, a day that would push the region to the edge once again. At approximately 4:30 a.m. Eastern Time, Iranian forces, operating through the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, launched an attack on a Panamanian-flagged oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. The vessel was carrying more than 2 million barrels of crude oil. This marked the second such attack on commercial shipping during the ceasefire period. The strike sent shockwaves through global energy markets and was immediately condemned by the United States as a clear provocation. In response, the U.S. military launched a large-scale counter-operation. American aircraft struck multiple high-value targets across Iran, including radar installations, UAV depots, missile launch sites, air bases, and air defense batteries. Video footage released by the Pentagon showed multiple precision strikes with secondary explosions visible at several sites. Later that day, former President Donald Trump, still highly influential in national security matters, posted a strong message on social media. He confirmed that U.S. forces had destroyed Iranian missile stockpiles, drone warehouses, and radar systems due to ceasefire violations. He issued a direct warning. If necessary, America would finish the job militarily, adding the chilling statement that Iran will not exist if the provocations continued. This was the second time Trump had used such stark language. Iran's retaliation was swift. The IRGC fired ballistic missiles and swarms of UAVs toward U.S. military installations in Bahrain and Kuwait. Iranian state media claimed that 8 American military sites were successfully hit. Kuwaiti authorities confirmed that their air defense systems were actively gauging incoming threats. As night fell on June 28 and extended into the early hours of June 29, another dramatic development unfolded in Baghdad. Iraqi military forces, supported by special operations units, moved tanks into the Green Zone. In coordinated raids, they arrested several high-profile Iraqi politicians with close ties to Iran. The operation was officially framed around corruption charges rather than terrorism in an apparent attempt to reduce political backlash. Meanwhile, in southern Lebanon near Nabatea, Israeli forces conducted fresh strikes against Hezbollah military infrastructure. Iran immediately accused Israel of violating the broader regional understanding tied to the MOU. By the end of this 4-hour period, the ceasefire that many had hoped would bring stability had instead become the stage for the most serious escalation in months. This chronology is not random. It reveals a dangerous pattern. A ceasefire that was meant to create space for diplomacy was instead used by Iran to reconstitute its military strength, a decision that has now forced the United States back into direct combat. The chain of events on the 28th of June, 2026, unfolded with terrifying speed and coordination, marking one of the most intense 4-hour periods in the entire conflict. It began on the evening of June 27 when U.S. Central Command CENTCOM announced fresh airstrikes inside Iran. These were not isolated attacks. American forces struck a wide range of military targets, including advanced surveillance systems, command and communication centers, air defense positions, UAV storage facilities, and infrastructure used for naval mine-laying operations. The strikes came approximately 48 hours after previous major American operations, signaling that Washington had lost patience with repeated Iranian ceasefire violations. Then, at precisely 4:30 a.m. Eastern Time on June 28, Iran delivered its response. IRGC forces attacked a large oil tanker flying the Panamanian flag as it transited the Strait of Hormuz. The vessel was carrying more than 2 million barrels of crude oil. This was the second documented attack on commercial shipping by Iran during the ceasefire period. The strike not only threatened global energy flows but also represented a direct challenge to the fragile truce. The United States responded with overwhelming force. Within hours, American warplanes conducted large-scale retaliatory strikes across multiple Iranian provinces. Targets included radar installations, additional UAV depots, missile launch sites, air bases, and remaining air defense batteries. Pentagon-released footage showed successive waves of precision-guided munitions hitting their marks, with bright secondary explosions lighting up the night sky. This was no longer a limited warning strike. It was a deliberate effort to degrade Iran's ability to project power in the Gulf. As the day progressed, former President Donald Trump weighed in powerfully on social media. He confirmed that U.S. forces had successfully destroyed Iranian missile stockpiles, drone warehouses, and radar networks due to clear ceasefire violations. In characteristically direct language, Trump warned that if Iran continued its provocations, the United States would have no choice but to finish the job militarily. He repeated his earlier strong statement, "Iran will not exist if the regime forces America's hand." This marked the second time Trump had used such existential language regarding the Iranian regime. Iran's retaliation came swiftly and on multiple fronts. The IRGC launched a coordinated barrage of ballistic missiles and UAVs targeting U.S. military installations in Bahrain and Kuwait. Iranian state media proudly announced that 8 American military facilities had been struck. Kuwaiti officials confirmed that their air defense systems were forced into action to intercept incoming threats, highlighting how the conflict was rapidly spreading across the region. Meanwhile, another critical development was taking place in Iraq. During the night of June 28 into the early morning of June 29, Iraqi military forces, supported by elite special operations units, advanced with tanks into Baghdad's heavily fortified Green Zone. In a series of rapid raids, they detained several prominent Iraqi politicians known for their close alignment with Tehran. Notably, The arrests were officially justified on charges of corruption rather than terrorism, a calculated move apparently designed to minimize sectarian and political fallout while still weakening Iran's influence inside Iraq. Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani oversaw the operation. At the same time, tensions continued to boil in southern Lebanon. Israeli forces carried out fresh airstrikes near Nabatea, targeting Hezbollah military infrastructure and supply lines. Iran immediately condemned the action as a violation of the broader regional memorandum of understanding, further complicating the already volatile situation. By the time June 28 ended, the ceasefire that had been carefully negotiated in June had effectively collapsed under the weight of rapid, multi-domain escalation. What began as targeted American strikes had evolved into a dangerous cycle of attack and counterattack, spanning the Strait of Hormuz, the Arabian Peninsula, Iraq, and Lebanon. This 4-hour sequence was not merely reactive. It revealed deep structural problems with the existing ceasefire framework problems that would be dramatically exposed in the following days. The most alarming revelation to emerge from the chaos of June 28 was not the immediate fighting, but what it exposed about the previous 10 weeks of ceasefire. According to a senior U.S. defense official interviewed by Fox News correspondent Jennifer Griffin, Iran had systematically rebuilt much of the military infrastructure that America had destroyed during the earlier bombing campaign. This reconstruction occurred throughout the ceasefire period that began on the 7th of April, 2026, a window of roughly 10 weeks. The scale and speed of this rebuilding effort were remarkable. Key locations included Qeshm Island, Sirak, and strategic areas along the Strait of Hormuz. These sites saw rapid restoration of air defense systems, missile production and storage facilities, and UAV launch capabilities. Satellite imagery and intelligence reports confirmed that Iran had not only repaired damaged infrastructure, but, in several cases, had expanded and hardened it. This development directly challenges the fundamental assumption behind the ceasefire, that both sides would honor the agreement and use the pause for genuine diplomacy. Instead, Iran treated the ceasefire as a strategic opportunity to rearm U.S. officials now admit that during this 10-week period, Iran managed to reconstitute significant portions of its air defense network and ballistic missile forces. Much of this progress was made possible through continued external support. Intelligence sources point to technical assistance and components flowing from both China and Russia. Beijing and Moscow, while publicly calling for restraint, appear to have quietly enabled Iran's recovery, a move that has serious long-term implications for the balance of power in the region. The consequences of this rebuilding became painfully obvious on June 28. When the United States conducted its latest round of strikes, many of the targets hit were facilities that American forces had already destroyed months earlier. This created a deeply frustrating strategic reality. The U.S. military is now forced to repeatedly strike the same targets because Iran has been given time and space to rebuild them under the cover of the ceasefire. This pattern represents a serious failure of the current diplomatic framework. The Memorandum of Understanding signed on June 17 lacked robust verification and enforcement mechanisms. Without meaningful international inspections or clear consequences for violations, Iran was able to exploit the pause in hostilities to restore its military capabilities. What makes this even more concerning is the nature of the rebuilt infrastructure. Many of the new facilities are being constructed with greater emphasis on survivability, buried deeper, better protected, and more mobile. This suggests Iran is learning from previous American strikes and adapting its strategy accordingly. The senior defense official's admission to Jennifer Griffin was particularly telling. When asked why American forces were striking targets they had previously destroyed, the response was blunt: because Iran used the ceasefire to rebuild them. This single statement captures the core strategic problem facing the United States in this conflict. The events of June 28 therefore represent more than just another tactical exchange. They expose a fundamental flaw in the ceasefire strategy, a flaw that has allowed Iran to regenerate its military power and prolong the conflict on terms more favorable to itself. This is the uncomfortable truth that now confronts American policymakers. Without strong verification measures and enforcement mechanisms, ceasefires with Iran do not lead to peace. They simply create the conditions for the next round of fighting. This pattern of repeated strikes has now evolved into what military analysts are calling a dangerous whack-a-mole strategy. The United States destroys Iranian capabilities, Iran uses the ceasefire to rebuild, and the cycle repeats. Each round of American strikes becomes more difficult and less decisive than the last. Compounding this challenge is Iran's most provocative statement yet. On June 28, the hardline Fars news agency reported that senior Iranian officials now believe the country has no choice but to pursue nuclear weapons. This was the first time Iran has publicly and officially framed the acquisition of nuclear arms as a necessary strategic objective rather than a defensive possibility. This declaration represents a major escalation in rhetoric and potentially in intent. It came amid the chaos of the day's military exchanges and may serve multiple purposes, signaling defiance to the United States, rallying domestic hardliners, or pressuring the international community. Whether it reflects actual policy, internal factional politics, or calculated psychological warfare remains uncertain, but its timing is highly significant. Even more concerning are developments at Iran's covert nuclear sites. U.S. defense officials have expressed growing alarm over a secret underground facility near Natanz, referred to as the Kolan and gas site. Construction activity indicates the Iranians are building at depths that may exceed the penetration capabilities of even America's most powerful conventional bunker buster, the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator. If these reports are accurate, it means the United States could soon lose the ability to effectively neutralize Iran's most critical nuclear infrastructure through conventional airstrikes alone. This shifts the entire strategic calculus and raises the stakes dramatically. The combination of the whack-a-mole cycle, Iran's public nuclear declaration, and the hardening of underground facilities creates a deeply troubling picture. The ceasefire, rather than reducing tensions, has allowed Iran to advance both its conventional military recovery and its long-term nuclear ambitions. What we witnessed on June 28 was not an isolated incident, but the direct result of a flawed strategic approach. Without robust monitoring, strict enforcement, and clear red lines, the current framework appears unsustainable. The United States finds itself trapped in a costly and repetitive military pattern, while Iran edges closer to capabilities that could fundamentally alter the regional power balance. After closely following the events of June 28, I must share my honest assessment. What we are witnessing is not simply another flare-up in the long-running U.S.-Iran rivalry. It is the direct and predictable consequence of a deeply flawed ceasefire strategy that has now backfired. The core insight here is painful but necessary. The ceasefire that began on April 7 did not de-escalate the conflict. It incubated it. By providing Iran with nearly 10 weeks of relative calm, the agreement gave the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps exactly what it needed to reconstitute its air defenses, missile forces, and drone capabilities. The strikes on June 28 were, in many cases, aimed at targets America had already destroyed months earlier. This is the definition of strategic failure. I have rarely seen a ceasefire produce such a counterproductive outcome. Instead of creating space for diplomacy, it created space for rearmament. This is why I believe we are now entering the most dangerous phase of the conflict since it began in February. Looking ahead, I see three primary scenarios that could unfold over the coming weeks and months. Scenario 1. The best case outcome, approximately 25% probability. A sudden return to serious diplomacy takes place. Shocked by the speed of the latest escalation, both Washington and Tehran, along with regional mediators, agree to an emergency framework that includes robust verification mechanisms, strict limits on Iranian military reconstruction, and clear consequences for violations. International inspectors gain meaningful access to key sites, including the underground facilities near Natanz. While difficult, this path could still salvage a fragile stability and prevent further regional spillover. Scenario 2. The most likely outcome, approximately 55% probability. The current whack-a-mole pattern continues. The United States maintains periodic airstrikes to degrade Iranian capabilities whenever they cross certain thresholds. Iran continues rebuilding during periods of reduced intensity, supported by its partners. Global oil prices remain volatile. The conflict stays contained but simmering, draining American resources and political will while gradually strengthening Iran's resilience and underground nuclear program. This is a slow bleed scenario that favors the side with greater endurance. Scenario 3. The worst case outcome. Approximately 2, 5, 30% probability. Tensions spiral rapidly. Iran accelerates its nuclear program in response to continued strikes. The underground facilities at Kolan and Gas become operational at depths beyond conventional reach. A major Iranian attack on Gulf shipping or U.S. assets triggers a decisive American and possibly Israeli response. The conflict expands to include direct strikes on Iranian leadership targets or critical nuclear infrastructure. Lebanon and Iraq descend deeper into chaos. The risk of a broader regional war becomes very real. What concerns me most, and what mainstream coverage often misses, is how the ceasefire has shifted the burden onto the United States. Every time America strikes, it pays a high operational and political cost. Meanwhile, Iran benefits from the narrative of resistance and uses the pauses to recover. This dynamic is unsustainable in the long term. The public declaration about pursuing nuclear weapons changes the game. Even if partly rhetorical, it normalizes the idea within Iranian domestic politics and hardens the position of hardliners. Combined with the rebuilding of conventional forces, it suggests Tehran is preparing for a prolonged confrontation on multiple levels. The fundamental problem remains the lack of credible enforcement. Without real monitoring and severe penalties for rebuilding prohibited capabilities, any future ceasefire will likely suffer the same fate as this one. In my view, the events of June 28 represent a critical inflection point. The United States must now decide whether to double down on a strategy of repeated, limited strikes, or fundamentally rethink its approach, including potentially more decisive action to break the cycle once and for all. The coming weeks will be decisive. The choices made now will determine whether this conflict remains a manageable crisis or becomes the spark for something far more dangerous. The rapid escalation on the 28th of June 2026 carries profound and far-reaching consequences that extend well beyond the immediate battlefield. Economically, the attack on the Panamanian oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz sent fresh shockwaves through global energy markets. With over 2 million barrels of crude at risk and shipping insurance premiums spiking, the incident served as a stark reminder of how vulnerable the world's most critical energy choke point remains. European and Asian economies, already sensitive to oil price volatility, face renewed pressure on inflation and supply chains. Every day of instability in the Gulf translates into higher costs for consumers worldwide. Militarily, the United States now finds itself locked in a costly cycle of repeated strikes. The need to re-attack targets previously destroyed reveals the limitations of the current strategy. American forces are expending expensive munitions and placing air crews at risk to manage a threat that the ceasefire was supposed to reduce. Meanwhile, Iran continues to demonstrate resilience, using asymmetric tools, drones, missiles, and proxy forces to stretch U.S. and allied defenses across multiple theaters. Regionally, the consequences are equally alarming. In Iraq, the military operation in Baghdad's Green Zone and the arrests of pro-Iranian politicians have deepened internal divisions and raised fears of renewed sectarian conflict. In Lebanon, Israeli strikes on Hezbollah positions risk triggering another round of cross-border violence. Bahrain and Kuwait, once relatively stable hosts for U.S. military presence, are now directly in the line of fire. The conflict is steadily widening its geographic footprint. Geopolitically, the events of June 28 have exposed and deepened existing fault lines. China and Russia, while avoiding direct involvement, continue to benefit strategically. Their quiet support for Iran's military reconstruction undermines Western efforts and strengthens their own influence in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states are watching closely, recalibrating their security calculations and accelerating defense partnerships. Israel, already conducting its own operations against Iranian proxies, faces increasing pressure to act more decisively. Perhaps most significantly, Iran's public declaration regarding the pursuit of nuclear weapons marks a dangerous rhetorical and possibly doctrinal shift. Even if the statement contains elements of bluff or internal signaling, it normalizes the idea of a nuclear-armed Iran within domestic politics and raises the stakes for all regional actors. Combined with progress on deeply buried nuclear facilities near Natanz, this development challenges the long-standing U.S. policy of preventing Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold. The broader strategic implication is clear. The current ceasefire framework has not only failed to deliver peace, but has actively undermined American and allied interests. It has allowed Iran to rebuild conventional capabilities while advancing its long-term nuclear ambitions. The United States is now paying the price in both blood and treasure for a diplomatic approach that lacked adequate verification and enforcement mechanisms. For the American public and policymakers, these developments raise difficult questions about the sustainability of the current approach. How long can the U.S. continue conducting repeated airstrikes with diminishing returns? What level of commitment is Washington willing to make to break the cycle rather than merely manage it? The events of June 28 demonstrate that limited military actions without a comprehensive strategy risk becoming an expensive and open-ended commitment. The conflict is no longer just about immediate tactical responses. It is about the future balance of power in the Middle East and the credibility of American deterrence in the region. As the dust settles from this latest round of escalation, one thing is certain. The decisions made in the coming weeks will have consequences that reverberate far beyond the waters of the Strait of Hormuz and the skies over Iran. The stakes have never been higher. In conclusion, the dramatic 24-hour escalation on the 28th of June 2026 has laid bare the fundamental failure of the current ceasefire strategy between the United States and Iran. What we witnessed was not an isolated incident, but the inevitable result of a flawed approach. The ceasefire that began on April 7 did not bring peace. Instead, it provided Iran with a dangerous window to rebuild its military capabilities that American forces had previously destroyed at great cost. The strikes on June 28, the attack on the oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, the missile barrages toward U.S. bases, and Iran's public declaration about pursuing nuclear weapons all point to one uncomfortable reality. The ceasefire has become a strategic liability rather than a solution. We are now trapped in a costly whack-a-mole cycle. America strikes, Iran rebuilds during periods of calm, and the United States is forced to strike again. Without strong verification mechanisms, enforcement measures, and clear consequences, this pattern will continue indefinitely, draining resources, destabilizing the region, and bringing Iran closer to the nuclear threshold. The events of June 28 represent the most serious phase of this conflict since it began in February. From the waters of Hormuz to the streets of Baghdad, from the skies over Iran to the border areas of Lebanon, the region stands on a dangerous precipice. After analyzing this situation in depth, my final assessment is clear. The current diplomatic and military approach is unsustainable. The United States must choose between continuing a frustrating cycle of limited strikes with diminishing returns or adopting a more decisive strategy that breaks the cycle once and for all. Half measures and hopeful ceasefires without teeth have only emboldened Iran and prolonged the conflict. The coming weeks will be decisive. The world will be watching whether Washington and its partners can establish real deterrence and meaningful oversight, or whether we will simply slide into another dangerous round of escalation. If you've found this analysis valuable and want to stay ahead of these rapidly developing events, I strongly encourage you to take action right now. Like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. What do you think is the right path forward? Should the U.S. pursue stronger military action or a completely new diplomatic framework? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss critical updates as this situation continues to evolve. We will be following every major development closely in the days and weeks ahead. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next video.